Hi, I'm Rachel. It's the last day of June, hopefully, and this is my mid-year check-in freak-out tag. I'm so excited to finally be joining the bandwagon, and I'm a little concerned that I might be rambling on forever. These tend to be some of my longer videos, generally speaking. But the first thing I'm going to do is make it a little bit longer with something only book adjacent, if I'm being kind to myself, because this is around the time, 4 years ago now, that I adopted my cat Missy. So I also like to do a little bit of a check-in on her. And this year in particular was a really difficult year for us, or more accurately, the last couple months have been kind of difficult because that's when I found what turned out to be a tumor on her body and had to take her to the vet and ultimately have it removed. And then there were, some post-surgical complications like, behavioral and health complications for a little while after that. So that was a little stressful. And we had some major changes, diet changes and schedule changes for me. So anyway, I'm glad that we're in a much more peaceful place now, because it was a little rough a couple months ago, but we're back on track. For the meat and potatoes of this tag, to talk about books and reading. So I actually am doing sort of a hybrid or conglomeration with this tag. There's the Freakout tag, which is the most popular tag on BookTube, and it has been for years. Then there's the check-in tag, which I think gained a little traction a couple of years ago and then mostly petered out. And then I have a couple of other questions from other sources that I've peppered in here, so I have a lot of attributions to leave down below. So without further ado, let's get into it, starting with the first question, which is, how many books have you read so far in 2022? And my answer is 58. Which is the largest number I've ever had. I've more or less read 10 books a month starting in January, and this is definitely straining my limits. I don't know if I can go any further, certainly not at this point of time. Like, for example, technically speaking, we're at the end of the month, but I'm only at 58 books, so, which is the best book I've read so far this year. And to answer that, I'm going to go to one that I feature behind me, although right now I seem to mostly be sitting in front of it. It is People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present by Dara Horn. This is an essay collection about sort of the phenomenon of what it feels like to be Jewish in America, but that's much more blasé, really. It's a variety of essays that track issues of fetishizing the Jewish past, particularly the Jewish past of persecution, often while ignoring Jews of the present, or simplifying history and trying to make the themes of Jewish death a little more universal and a little less about Jews and Jewish history. Feel like in the vein of essays from minority groups sort of parsing the issues of what it is to sort of be on the outside. This sort of brought me a sense of clarity and also a little bit of comfort and also a bit of challenging myself about what I think and feel. I mean, Horn is a very educated woman, both through her graduate studies in Jewish history and literature and culture, and also through her upbringing. So I feel like she was a great voice for me to engage with, and I really appreciate this book. The next question is the best sequel I've read so far this year, and I'm going to go with Leviathan Falls by James S.A. Corey. This is part of the Expanse novels, which is a sprawling sci-fi science fiction epic series. I talked about a lot, especially last year when I read most of the books in the series. And I actually recently listened to Rachel Colinati talked about reading this book, and it sort of revamped my feelings of love for the book. I mean, I feel like I could quibble with the final trilogy of books 7, 8, and 9. In a way, the epic fantasy feel of it took away from the realpolitik feel in a way, but not entirely. I do feel like, as Rachel said, there was a consistency of tone, and I enjoyed what the authors did with all of their characters. To be vague and avoid spoilers, but in general, I think they're gestalt about the meaning of life kind of matches mine completely, especially with what they put into their main character Holden's mouth about, sure, we live in a society, certainly as explicated through these books, that can be brutal and warmongering, but there's these acts of kindness between people and things worth living for. Next, we have the best short story collection I've read, and for this, I just finished, this is book 58 itself, Night at the Fiestas by Kirsten Valdez Quade, which I decided to add very recently to my reading pile, which is very unusual for me. I usually plan things well in advance, but I'm excited for this question in particular because I love reading short story collections, and usually by this point of the year, maybe I've only read the best American short stories at the beginning of the year, and I want to add in a few more. Well, maybe I've also read a couple of literary journals I talk about in a video earlier in the year, but anyway, back on track here. This is a collection of literary short stories, and I really loved it. The last book I read so far of the year was a 5-star, really a high note. These are really compelling stories. They are long, they are complicated in terms of really containing a lot. There is nuanced characters and situations to be had in these 20 to 25 page short stories. To my mind, this really puts Quade in line with authors, short story authors like Jhumpa Lahiri and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I mean, they also write novels too, but their short stories are also as deep and intricate and really show what it is to be human in these complex situations that can be parsed and have such promise in so few pages. Next, I'm going to go into my most read genre of the half year, and this is when I go to Goodreads and the personal way that I shelve my books with the categories, and with that, my most read subgenre of the moment is Jewish fiction with 16 books, which I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised about. Somehow I figured it might be general fiction, but it wasn't. It was Jewish fiction, I guess because a lot of the books at the top of my Goodreads were Jewish fiction and so forth. And anyway, I'm closely followed by speculative fiction at 15 books. So yeah, and for speculative fiction, I usually put in anything that I would deem as science fiction or fantasy in adult and YA categories. Now it is time to shame myself with books on my shelves that I haven't read yet, starting with new releases that I talked about at the beginning of the year that I wanted to read, and now I own them and still haven't read them yet. To return to The Expanse, which I talked about earlier, here is a collection of novellas that are sort of adjacent to the main action of the series. This is called Memories Legion, the Complete Expanse Story Collection by James S.A. Corey, which I haven't read yet. Here is a historical novel, although I think some people will call it history. I think I might refuse to because it takes place in the 1990s. Fencing with the King by Diana Abu Jaber. I read one of her earlier books years ago in college and loved it, and I'm so thrilled to have the chance to get back to her once I actually do that. And finally, I have a couple of books on my anticipated reads list that I just got out of the library and actually intend to read next month. So huzzah, making progress here. Starting with The Thousand Eyes by A.K. Larkwood, which is a fantasy sequel novel. And then there's Beautiful Little Fools by Gillian Cantor, which is historical fiction and a Great Gatsby retelling, I think, which turns Gatsby's death into a sort of murder mystery. Next, I move on into new anticipated releases coming out in the second half of the year, but one of these is kind of a repeat. I'm going to talk about Wind Daughter by Joanna Ruth Meyer, which I did put on my anticipated reads in January when it was slated to come out in May, but alas, the date was moved to July 12th. Also on July 12th comes out A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers, which is a bona fide sequel to her novella A Song for the Wild Built. Moving on to July 19th, I have From the Jump by Lacey Walden, which is her second romance novel. We were in a writing group together before COVID. Also on the 19th is Schmutz by Felicia Berliner, which I heard about just a few weeks ago when the Jewish Book Council did a event with her, luckily with a Zoom option, so I could sneak in and attend as well. This concept seems really intriguing to me. It is about a Hasidic woman from the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community who I think wants to have a relatively traditional life and get married, but she has a big problem in that she is nursing a secret porn addiction. Finally, moving out of July, I'm going to August 16th and The Oleander Sword by Tasha Suri, which is another fantasy sequel. And the final book I want to talk about that's coming out in 2022 and I hope to get to this year comes out on September 13th. It's called On Repentance and Repair, Making Amends in an Unapologetic World by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. Rabbi Ruttenberg, or Rabbi Danya, she's a woman I follow a lot on Twitter. I've met in person once. In fact, I have one of her other books up here that I should get to as well. I really like her complicated, nuanced take on Jewish and other worldly issues. Although I do believe that Ruttenberg will be leaning a lot on the ruminations of a medieval Jewish scholar, Maimonides, which will also be fun and informative. Going into a little bit of negative space, the next question is your biggest disappointment so far of the half year, and mine certainly is APEIROGON by Colum McCann. This is a book I think I really built up in my head, especially as it went a little bit through the BookTube Prize and it won some major awards, including in the National Jewish Book Awards areas. And I've also read one of McCann's short stories and Best American Short Stories, which tackles what he tackles in the novel, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I really liked what he did and what empathy he showed in that short story. And it's not that he's not empathetic in the novel, but I just feel like it is way too high in the sky. And I was very disappointed by how little it seemed to deal with actual, real human characters, which is really the crux of, I think, what you need to be talking about in such a fraught conflict, especially where people often seem to dehumanize each other. As an honorary mention, I'm going to mention a very recent read as well, which is The Unwilling by Kelly Braffett. This is a fantasy novel where I feel like there was a really interesting, fantastical premise, and really the vast majority of this sprawling novel is just misery porn and torture porn, which really obscures the far more fascinating and fantastical elements. Next, my biggest surprise of the year is The Hilltop by Assaf Gavron, translated by Steven Cohen. I wouldn't have known or read about this book if it weren't for my synagogue's Israel book club, but I was immediately wary because it takes place in the occupied territories in a settlement that is the most illegal of the settlements, in that the Israeli government refuses to legitimize them, but their presence there means that the army has to come and protect them, and they kind of get what they want anyway by exploiting the rules, and I was very wary about giving characters like this a voice, and what that would mean, but luckily I really feel like this book worked. It's a satire, it's not an apologetic book about who these people are. In fact, I think a lot of the times the characters are pretty unlikable, but I feel like it really accurately depicts the world they live in, and, you know, they're not unlikable to the point of caricature. I mean, I think that there's a handful of characters, and not all of them are really well developed, but the main two brothers who come to this settlement for different reasons and have, you know, complex backstories, they really give this novel an emotional, a human heart. They're all imperfect characters, but I feel like I really fell into this world and appreciated what Gavron tried to do in showing the complexity and in showing the humanity even, and showing the absurdity. My favorite new author of the half year so far is Kirsten Valdez Quade. This is part of the main reason I read her short story collection just now, you know, Night at the Fiestas, so that I could read all of her backlist before sitting down to say that she is a new favorite author. The other book that I read for the BookTube Prize a few months ago is The Five Wounds, which is her first novel. And in fact, The Five Wounds here is the continuation of a story that she started in Night at the Fiestas. And again, I just love what the complexity that she brings to characters, imperfect characters, and complex situations, nuanced situations. So I will definitely be looking forward to what she does next. The next question is the ever controversial newest fictional crush, which I think a lot of people, you know, just skip past, but I have sort of morphed it into my own sort of question, which anyone is free to take, where I talk about my favorite fictional, usually relationship, that I've read about this year. So I'm going to start with a sort of honorary mention and mention Holden and Naomi from the Expanse series. Technically, I've been invested in these characters for far longer than I've even been reading the Expanse books, because I started my journey with this series by watching the TV adaptation, which ran for 6 seasons and just ended at the very beginning of this year. And in fact, I feel like I can't fully use this as my pick, because the books are not as strong with this as the show is, I think. So my real answer for this, in terms of a book answer, comes from The Reluctant Daughter by Leslie Newman. There is technically a romantic relationship I could highlight in here between the main character Lydia Pinkowitz and her partner Allie, and it's a good, strong relationship. I like it, but I think the even stronger relationship is between Lydia and her mother Doris, which is really the axis this story turns on, because they start out in a very antagonistic relationship where, you know, Doris really refuses to engage with Lydia about her life as this stalwart, womanist, feminist, lesbian, all-out lesbian and academic in these fields. And doesn't really find her life at all like intriguing, or, you know, what she wanted for her daughter. So they're estranged in the beginning, but then Doris has this horrible medical incident where she's put in the hospital, and Lydia turns out to be one of the only people who can reach out to her, and it turns into the two of them kind of making amends, but not in a clean way, and not in a full way, in a much more complicated and real way, about, you know, learning what, you know, angst and gripes to get rid of, and, you know, what to nurture instead in your relationships with, you know, difficult family members. For my newest favorite character, I'm going to go with 2 of the major side characters in A Burning by Megha Majumdar, Lovely and P.T. Sir. This is a book that takes place in India. The main character is a young Muslim woman who lives in the slums and posts something negative on Facebook about a explosion that took place at a train station near her home. And the government glomps onto her and accuses her of setting off this explosion. And she is put on trial of a sort, and these two people in her life, Lovely and P.T. Sir, are sort of her character witnesses, but sort of not. They have their own biases. I think part of what really intrigues me about these characters are, in a way, how they are written. So some of it really is more about the craft, in a way, about anything else, because Majumdar uses different tenses for both of them, and Lovely in particular uses a first-person continuous present tense, which is a very unique style. She is a character who is transgender in a very specific Indian cultural way. And then P.T. Sir was a teacher at Javon, the main character's school, who actually felt sorry for her a little bit, and then Javon had to leave school to take care of her family because they were so impoverished. And P.T. Sir has a bit of a chip on his shoulder about, like, who he is in the world, and like he doesn't get the respect he wants, so he finds himself enthralled to a nationalist party. And these were two characters who really have stuck with me throughout this half year. And I will continue to hold up this book for my next question, which is a book that made you cry. I'm not sure if technically I cried over this, but it engendered a sort of, by the end of the book, a sort of mindset of extreme hopelessness that just made me feel so down that if I wasn't crying, certainly part of me inside was, because this is a book about how the government intentionally stacked against this young woman, Jeevan, who really made it impossible for her to defend herself, stripped her rights away in ways that in a democracy technically are just unconscionable, and by the end of it, you know, they are able to do really what they wanted to do all along, which is to punish her in the worst of ways. And after a long fight against absolutely unwinnable odds, she reaches the end of her journey, and it is just heartbreaking in a way of feeling completely defeated by life. It is quite a bleak book by the end of it. As an honorary mention, I think I'll pick up another nonfiction book I read so far this year. This is Know My Name by Chanel Miller, a memoir written by the Emily Doe victim of a recent infamous campus rape court case in the U.S., one of the rare ones that actually was able to go to court, and one of the rare ones where she actually won against her abuser, kind of, sort of, she won. His sentencing was in fact incredibly light, and there was such a backlash to his sentencing that the judge who passed down the sentence was ultimately voted out of office. So Miller's story is kind of a linchpin for a lot of change. It also came about during the advent of the Me Too movement, when we were starting to talk about sexual assault in terms of how common it is rather than how uncommon it is. So the story is obviously very compelling and very sad, even on its surface, but really what made this one rise above the others is because Miller is such a strong writer, and in fact rose to fame when she was still anonymous, because she published her impact letter that she wrote for the sentencing part of the trial. It's not a happy ending sort of story, although it's not entirely bleak as well, because there are some avenues to make things better for Miller personally and for victims more generally. But certainly it can, if it didn't make me cry, it certainly could make me sad about the realities of the pitfalls of my own culture in the U.S. Where this book was taking place. For a book that made me happy, I'm returning again to People Love Dead Jews, which is a strange one to say made me happy, because there's a similar bleakness to the worldview in this book that I've mentioned in the recent ones that I've talked about. But I'm happy that it worked for me. I was frustrated. I wanted to hear a perspective that I was grappling with about the objectification and fetishization of Jews be expressed by a strong writer, and that's what I got in this book, so that's why it makes me happy. My favorite review or booktube video, you know, I have a couple of perennial ones that I can mention all the time, like my booktube prize videos or my maybe Midrash readathon videos, but to stick with something completely new, I'm going to turn to a series of videos I did for this half year called the Would You Read It Challenge, which I co-opted from a tag started by Et2 Brody, where the point was to choose a variety of books and read the first sentence of each book and ask your audience, would you continue with these books? And instead I, chose a couple of paragraphs to give a little more grounding. And I particularly took on the motif every month of taking a bird's eye view of 1 year of my reading life, starting with 2021, and the final one I did just at the beginning of this month was for 2015. So I chose 12 books for each of those videos, the first book I've read per month. And it was a way for me to reread parts of them and revisit my thoughts on them. And they were surprisingly popular, I think, for my small fry booktuber self. So it's making me think about if I should revisit this type of video for the future. I don't think I'm going to go backward in years, like to 2014 and before, because 2015 was really the time when my reading solidified more or less into what it is now, where I was reading enough for me to do a tag like this, and I was documenting all of my reading on, my literary blog and on booktube and etc. So I feel like I'm done with looking back on my past and reading. I might go ahead and make videos like this for the BookTube Prize, which I'm obsessed with, and also if I focus on reading and talking through the first few paragraphs of those books are certainly popular because they were up for a prize. So that could be fun, so stay tuned. My favorite book to film adaptation or book to TV miniseries adaptation I saw this year. This is a complicated one. There were some great adaptations I saw this year, including the series finale for The Expanse. But I feel like I have to go with the miniseries adaptation of Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, which is an imperfect miniseries. I'll link to my review down below, and I did have some quibbles with a couple of character and plot points, but I can't get away from the feeling overall that what I took away from it were the types of feelings I also took away from the book, even if they were technically expressed a little bit differently in both of them, and there were differences. Some of them that I didn't like, and some that I really liked a lot. Honestly, what this showed was that the important thing is about the overall message, and that's really where they nailed it, and I just have been sitting with this miniseries the way I've been sitting with the book for years. I think I might be sitting with the miniseries for years. For the most beautiful cover I bought this year, I am going with Fencing with the King by Diana Abu Jaber. I just love the color scheme, the washed out pastel colors are just so pretty. I guess technically this falcon is a little bit covered by the writing, which is a little unfortunate, I suppose. But I also like this stark red edging, which I guess is on both sides of the book as well. And I guess this doesn't technically count, but I like the sort of grainy feel of the cover, which isn't about how it looks, but is about how it feels. Next is my next big priority in my reading, and I'm someone who plans most of my TBR way in advance, even months in advance. So I have a lot of books I could be putting on here to talk about, I guess, everything or almost everything I'd be reading in July and etc. But instead I'm going to kind of go as literal as I can with this and talk about the biggest book on my TBR, which I do plan to read next month. This is BARKSKINS by Annie Proulx. It takes place in Canada starting in the 17th century, moving close to modern day, about some woodcutters, some barskins, and this family that's been involved in that business ever since Canada was called New France, which I was so compelled. I love sprawling epics, and of course the page count for this supports that premise. But at the same time, it can be so daunting. There have been times when I could have read this book, like it came up in a TBR game that I played several months ago, and I put it aside in part because I was intimidated by the page count, which is in the 700s, I believe. But of course, if I do that forever and I just put it off, that would be a shame to ignore books just because they're so long. So now, currently, it is near the top of my Goodreads TBR, and for me, that is the no-holds-barred situation where I have to get to it no matter what. So that is my intention and my goal, and I will be reporting back, hopefully, very soon. The next question is, what is my bookish highlight of the year? And I just, in my last question, talked a little bit about TBR games I play. I talked about how I sort of failed myself with that TBR game by, ignoring a book that intimidated me. But overall, I have been playing these two TBR games for more than just this year, but I'll just highlight it this year. I play my page 112 tag where I tackle my physical unread shelves. And then I play the booktube spin, which was started by Rick McDonnell, where you make up a random list of 20 books and then read whichever one he spins. And both of these TBR games have been a way for me to read books that have been on my shelves forever, that I may never have gotten to otherwise, or would have taken much longer perhaps for me to get to justify getting to. Especially some science fiction and fantasy books, which is exciting, because I don't actually have a lot of them on my official lists for whatever reason, so I use my TBR games to, get to them. And so overall, this TBR game thing has been very exciting and a more spontaneous way to pick a reading list, and also successful. And the final question, which certainly isn't coming too soon, I've been watching my battery drain as I've been sitting here, is what books do you have to read by the end of the year, which is a final last-ditch effort to guilt myself about things I haven't gotten to yet, more on the backlist side this time. So the two books I'm going to highlight for this are the Foundation trilogy, so not only one book, but three, by Isaac Asimov, which I bought at the end of last year with the intent of reading it in December, but I put it aside relatively quickly, probably because of, well, the premise is so fascinating. It's like, what will human society be like in hundreds of thousands of years? And then Asimov takes us in to sit with a bunch of newspaper reading, cigar chomping men, and the only woman in sight is a secretary. So I don't know why the far, far future looks so much like Mad Men. I know I was expecting it, but it still was such, I guess, a turn-off to me. I want something much more dynamic that befits his premise, and I know that there's some philosophical things he gets into which are of interest, but the characters not so much, and also, just to put it out there, Isaac Asimov isn't the best writer. And finally, a second book I will guilt myself on is Scary Old Sex, which is a short story collection by Arlene Hayman, which actually I intended to read this month, but instead, just a couple of weeks ago, I had a change of heart because I wanted to answer a couple more questions on this tag, which I was then able to answer with another book, and so I put this one aside to do that, because there's only so much time to read. But I highlighted this book back in a blog post I wrote in May about Jewish American short story collections, and so I was hoping to read it shortly thereafter, and now I've been kicking it down the road a bit. So I only want to kick it so far. I definitely want to get to this book before the end of the year, so we'll see how I do. So that about covers it for me now. You can find links to everything I've talked about here, Goodreads reviews, Goodreads book pages, booktube pages, all listed down below, and of course everything is time-stamped. You'll have seen that at the beginning because I'm sure this video is a beast. Oh boy, I'm not quite looking forward to the post-production. So I hope if you have watched any part of this video, you have found something compelling in what I've had to say, maybe put some books on your TBR. I would love to talk to you about any of the books that you have been reading in this half year. Hopefully the freak out isn't too bad and you've largely been having fun with your list. So anyway, I will be back on this channel hopefully tomorrow for another wrap-up video of sorts for my writing quarterly goals wrap-up for the spring, so stay tuned for that. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.